All right, Miles, let's talk about the Tennessee Volunteers here for a little bit. So Tennessee came into the season, right? Like kind of tampered expectations. They're kind of waiting to see exactly what this team will do if they can take another step this season. And so far they did it, obviously knocking off Pitt in a huge matchup heading into their game against Akron this Saturday. And there's obviously a lot of positive energy behind Tennessee right now. They're ranked number 15th in the latest AP poll. So obviously there's some good energy, good vibes. What could this mean? Who's standing out? Where could this energy take this team? I know you've got some specific things to go over in a second. Before I hand it off to you, volunteer fans, we want to hear from you. Put in the comment section, what player on this team have you been most excited to see so far this season? There's been a lot of bright spots on offense, on defense, and we're going to get into it. But we want to hear from you specifically. Who are you most excited to see through the first two games of the season? But Miles, give us the latest out of Knoxville.
Yeah, Nick. So my bright spot for Tennessee isn't necessarily I'm going to leave the fans to tell us a player, but one thing in general is defense, not offense. Defense has been the brightest spot for Tennessee so far. And according to the folks over at Saturday Down South, they brought up some interesting points I want to discuss to help us jump off into our greater conversation. But one, Tennessee has been able to get off the field on third down this season at a very high rate, and it's something they haven't necessarily been as good at in the past. But this season, Tennessee's opponents are 9 for 32 on third down, which is pretty impressive. They're able to get off the field. The opponents are only converting 28% of the time, and Pitt really struggled against them to convert third downs. I think that's able to help them come out on top in such a big game, a crucial game for Tennessee to get good momentum going into the season. And obviously, the other thing is the defense has been stepping up when it counts. Again, going back to the Pitt game, the biggest game of the season so far, the defense came up multiple times in crucial moments. They had the sack in overtime that sealed the game. They had a big pick. They had all kinds of stuff that really, really helped them get off the field, get the offense back on the field, and get that offense running because the offense has looked pretty good with Hendon Hooker behind the helm as well. What do you think about Tennessee, Nick?
So I think the important thing about Tennessee and the fact their defense is looking good and they're starting strong is the fact of what this means long term for the program. And I'm going to pair it with two other teams, right? I'm going to talk about the Clemson Tigers here for a second. Now, Clemson has kind of taken a step back from the dominant eras a few years ago. Now, why does that matter? Is because Clemson, Tennessee, and in some extents Georgia, that kind of I call it the Smoky Mountain corridor, where you have North Georgia, Tennessee, and kind of the upstate Carolinas. There's a lot of really, really good football in that area, and that is so brutally competitive. And Clemson and in some parts Georgia has absolutely owned that part of the country over the last few years. Now you see Clemson having some issues early on. Georgia's Georgia, but obviously that's a whole other story. The fact that Tennessee can start strong and look good doing it and have some athletes step up, I think that's going to do wonders for recruiting, especially getting off to the strong start. Beating Pitt was big, Pitt being a ranked opponent. People know a lot about Pitt. Obviously, Kenny Pickett played there. There's a lot of notoriety behind that, so on and so forth. And so obviously starting strong and making plays, that'll drive wonders for recruiting. Because the thing about college football that's so interesting to me is the fact that every win matters, not in the sense of like rankings and potentially making to a conference title game, but building your program. It's the opposite of the NFL where if you lose a few games, well, you get a better draft pick. If you lose a few games in college, you could potentially lose recruits, which affects your program long term. That's why the way Tennessee has started the season by playing good comparable football, offense and defense, complementary football, will go a long way in driving the recruits and winning back what I'm calling the Smoky Mountain corridor. Because you think Clemson gave them an opening here. So this is really important for Tennessee to play well so they can capture those recruits, and they're doing it. And I think they can just maintain that. Their trajectory will continue to go up.
Yeah, Nick, and there's a couple more points I have to bring into this conversation. But right now, I kind of want to break down Tennessee's schedule for the rest of the year. And I'm going to give you my thoughts on it, and I want to hear yours as well. But this week, they're coming into Akron. Should be an easy game. Keep that momentum flowing. Go into Florida game 3
At
and
home.
0. Yep. And Florida looks vulnerable. This is a Florida team that isn't quite as great as we thought they could have been. Obviously, tough loss this past weekend, but Tennessee against Florida, Tennessee's ranked higher than Florida right now, and so they have a really good chance. You beat Florida, you go to LSU. If you can beat LSU, which I think you have a pretty good chance to beat them, they look very
I agree.
lackluster so far. You roll into Alabama 5-0. Now that is going to be an extremely tough game, but Tennessee has given them.
Texas almost beat Alabama, right? I mean, Alabama is not invincible the way they've played the past, couple years or so. They are very beatable. Still a big task, but it's not impossible to get Alabama in Knoxville and at least give them a really strong game because
Oh
we've
yeah,
seen that from Alabama. They are beatable.
yes, and so Tennessee's been able to play Alabama tough in the past. Tennessee's a team that I think they can really play anybody pretty tough. They play to the level of their opponent very well. So, like you said, Texas gave Alabama some fits. I think Quinn Ewers, Hendon Hooker, both great quarterbacks. Maybe Tennessee can probably, let's say they win that one. Then you
Yeah,
go to Tennessee Martin. You got Kentucky, which is also, I believe, a winnable game. Now,
at home.
Georgia's tough, okay? Georgia on the road, a tough game. But if you only lose one, that's not so bad. Then you finish the season out with Missouri, South Carolina, Vanderbilt. So you have a very doable schedule because I think Tennessee looks better than they have in a long, long time right now. Just the offensively, like I brought up earlier, defensively. So I'm really excited to see how they run the table the rest of the season. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah. So there's a path to 10 wins, even if they lose to Alabama and Georgia, right? I think Kentucky and the Kentucky, I feel like is always a feel good team. They always start 5-0, 8-0, whatever, 7-1. They always rank really high. And then the SEC schedule comes and does its job and just bludgeons them back down to earth. I think Kentucky's a little bit mirage. So getting them later in the year, I think actually benefits Tennessee. I mean, you look at Florida. I think Florida's kind of overrated. They lost to Kentucky. They should have lost to Utah, to be honest, who the Utah was a top 10 team who I think that was a little unwarranted. That was kind of built off last season. But nonetheless, I don't think Florida is as good as people want to think they are. LSU's kind of a dumpster fire right now. I think they handle LSU, even though it's on the road. But I mean, you look at the schedule. I mean, I think there's a very clear path to 10 wins here. And let's say, the fact they get Alabama at home, let's say they stun Alabama. That will be an absolutely redunculous move for them in terms of recruiting long-term in the SEC, right? Because this whole dynamic of the reconferencing and when you have Oklahoma and Texas joining, you're going to start having Alabama and all these schools in the SEC West are going to have to start competing with those guys more. So the fact that Tennessee can potentially take some of that, I'll call it SEC East competitive recruiting wise from beating the team like Florida, from beating a team like Alabama, again, long term, right? Building that recruits, building that program, becoming a top 10 program again. That's how you do it. And I think the opportunity is really there for Tennessee this season, and they can take advantage of it.
Yeah, Nick. And finally, the last piece of this puzzle is quarterback Hendon Hooker has
Okay.
looked really good so far this season. Through 2 games, he's thrown for 546 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, clean player. He looked really good against Pitt. Obviously, he's got an 82 QBR. That's pretty good. I just think that this guy behind the helm has given Tennessee a little bit of upgrade. I think he's one of the better quarterbacks that they've had in quite a while. And he being a senior, he's got a lot of experience under his belt. He comes from that Smoky Mountain quarter you talked about. He's from
Yep.
Greensboro, North Carolina. But he's a big guy, 6'4", 218. He's slinging it well out there. I just think overall that he's a really great fit at Tennessee, don't you think?
100%. And again, you stole my point from me. And the theme of my discussion today with Tennessee is recruiting, because Tennessee used to be one of the recruiting powerhouses in the country, not just the SEC, in the country. And again, winning the local areas I've deemed the Smoky Mountain Quarter, North Carolina, South Carolina, those upstates, Georgia, obviously the state of Tennessee, as start competing overall, dominating those areas again, and then spreading out nationally. That is the way for Tennessee to be a perennial top 10, top 15 program again. And the way you do that is by winning these early season matchups. And the way you do that, the next step level over is getting high quality performance from a guy like Hooker. So it's all kind of aligning for Tennessee. Now it's on them to just ride that consistency. Don't fall off. Don't take a game off, and just keep riding that momentum and continuing to build it forward the rest of the season.